Moving on to deontology, a lot of the origins of deontology came from religious doctrine, or this idea of divine command, that an omniscient God has told us how we should behave. And we see this in the form of the Bible and biblical stories, in the Quran, in the enlightenment of the Buddha, even though one wouldn't call Buddha a god by any stretch of the imagination. He was a teacher and an inspired prophet, one would argue. So regardless, the idea is that there is an omniscient being that's told us how we should behave. So we do think some of the origins of this idea of deontology, deos being a god, or deon meaning duty, interesting how those things kind of play together. The goal here is that we have a duty to behave in a particular way. There's one way to behave. Kant and Rawls argue that it's not necessarily based on religion. It sometimes can be based on what is simple common sense. Even though religion has taken on much of this, ethics sort of supersedes religions, and some would argue that sort of ethical theory manifests itself in religious doctrine, perhaps, is one way to think about it. I don't know. I don't know how I think about it. I haven't spent an enormous amount of time on it, but you can see how you could certainly make that argument. Regardless, Kant and Rawls saying it doesn't have to be based on religion. It could be based on simple common sense ethics and how one should behave, around treating others. The foundation for this is really that the ends never justify the means. We never, ever, ever treat people as a means to an end. And when we treat them as a means to an end, if we use them, and our intention is to use them and to hurt them, it's never justified as an ethical behavior with any stretch of the imagination. So it's about intent. It's about what I want to do, and it's about how I then manifest the behavior around that intention that becomes a concern. Within the ethical lens inventory, we call this the rights and responsibilities lens, because that rights and responsibilities lens is focused on duties and what my duties are to my community, to myself, to my work. Those are the key stakeholders in that context. So universalism, again, that deontological rights-based approach to things, can be deconstructed by Kant as having a twofold inquiry. Number one, is the decision dictated by a universal principle? Do we have a universal principle for fairness or due process or my moral rights to privacy, those sorts of things? And if not, if there isn't a universal principle already, could there be one? Could the decision become a universal rule? So, you might say, well, we don't have a universal rule based on certain rights, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist, and should we create a right around that? Sometimes it then becomes quantified into laws, right? But not always. And you can look at the gay rights movement as a great example of that. The important thing to note from universalism is the belief that everyone has the same universal rights to privacy, to freedom of consent, to freedom of speech, those sorts of things. Everyone has the same access to those universal rights, and as long as their rights are not being impinged on by somebody else, you're entitled to your opinion on those sorts of things. It looks to good or right intentions in terms of, doing the right thing no matter what, even if the outcome is not always the best. If your intentions are good, that's what really matters the most. And again, we can see how, in contrast to utilitarianism, universalism is about what the intention is, and utilitarianism about what the outcome is. And is there a way to think about, can you have good intentions and good outcomes? Wouldn't the most moral thing to be to have them combined, perhaps, to have good intentions and to ensure that the outcome is the fairest to the most people? Who's to say? In reality, though, the most important thing Kant would argue is that we should respect the dignity of each and every individual human being, period. Everybody deserves dignity. Everybody deserves to have certain moral rights. No one is more important or less important than anyone else. And that's where, again, you see some commonalities with utilitarianism, where it would argue, utilitarianism argues, no one's rights or happiness is more important than another. And it's the same thing here with Kant. No one's should be treated with more or less dignity than the other. So there's some similarities there. So universalism, as any other theory, has its strengths and weaknesses, and of course the most important strengths are that it has a very collective logic, that it's consistent, that it's the same, everyone gets treated the same way with the same ideas. It's not arbitrary, it's not I'll treat you this way this time, but I'll treat you differently another time. It has a high sense of motivation to behave in a particular consistent way. But the problem is, where do we find the universal principles? There isn't agreed upon in all situations what is an important universal principle that everybody would agree to. I mean, we can look at this idea of, well, we shouldn't kill. Yeah, that sounds great, except for what if you're in war? What if it's self-defense? Are there circumstances where it might actually be okay to kill somebody, that it's justified? And it becomes more the focus on, even if the intention was to kill, was it self-defense or, regardless, so that the outcome may be, well, you're not supposed to kill somebody, but really, if the intention is for self-defense, is it then okay? So all of a sudden, as you start to say, there's no if, ands, or buts, there's no gray area, we should never kill, it's really hard to impose that on others in terms of figuring out where those boundary conditions are. So what starts to happen with these universal principles is they get complex and they get conditional. And so they have, well, there's an exception here, but not over here. This is an exception there, but not there. And this is where it starts to get complex and complicated. And, when you start to have exceptions to rules, then do the rules really work? That's kind of one of the hard things about universalism. If these rules are supposed to be consistent and applied to everybody, they become immovable. That people don't get to have free will in terms of using them with discretion. So if someone's trying to kill my kid, I can't act in self-defense to support my kid. So therefore it becomes incredibly wrong to kill no matter what, and therefore I would be there's something wrong with the fact that I would want to defend my child. If I don't get to use that discretion in that moment, is that a problem? Some would argue it is. Some people say no. The goal here is to be consistent, and you have to apply the consistent rules all the time. And I can see some value in that as well. So, and we can see how the challenge comes in here. So when you have conflicting rights, looking at the freedom of religion versus the freedom of gays and lesbians to, love and have relationships, there's conflicting rights right there. How do you justify it? There's not a universal right that one could, go to that would feel like it would necessarily meet both needs. So when you have these conflicting rights, whose rights win? Is it my rights or their rights? So this idea of universalism suddenly says, wow, your freedom of religion and my freedom, to live and love as, same-sex relationship are in direct conflict with each other. Who's right and who's wrong? And, we don't have an answer to that, unfortunately. At least not within ethical theories, perhaps. So another question that kind of comes up with universalism is, if you did the right thing, what if you hurt somebody? And you hurt an animal or a person or somebody? Even if your intentions are good, you still hurt someone. Does that mean it was ethical then? And under universalism, it would say, yes, it is. But again, based on utilitarianism, you hurt somebody. So the outcome wasn't ethical necessarily, right? So again, we get into this debate between doing the right thing versus, having the right intentions, but having the right outcomes. And they start to get in conflict with each other. The golden rule says, we treat others, as we'd want to be treated, but the question that the golden rule then asks, as a logical conclusion is, what if you don't care how others treat you? What if it doesn't matter to you? What if you're, a psychopath, and you don't care? We have a warped sense of conscience. And so it doesn't matter to me, how I get treated. So therefore, I'm just going to do whatever it is that I want to do. And that's hard for people to think about that. I mean, the golden rule works when everybody follows it, and not everybody follows it. So that's, that's a hard thing to kind of get your head around.